Hello there and welcome to a new build guide for Age of Wonders 4. This one is another one for the Reavers, and it is a abduction and seduction build which will utilize mostly the subdue ability of your racial supporters. They can convert pretty much everything, and we're making good use of that in this build. It is really amazing. It has weaknesses, but apart from that, once it's rolling and kicking, it feels almost like cheating, and I loved every moment of it. It has been playtested on brutal difficulty, and I'm going to go over all the details with you now. So let's start with the racial and cultural traits. Hideous Stench is the trait that you cannot skip here. Hideous Stench makes the enemy's resistances go lower, especially status resistance. This is important because that makes it easier to convert enemies, because their status resistance is lower as soon as somebody is standing right next to them. The minus resistance is also very useful because we end up with a lot of supporters and elemental damage dealers here, so it's also a very powerful thing. Keen-sighted, I picked that because of the abundance of ranged attackers in the build, but in all honesty, here is a slot that you can fill to your own liking. A lot of the 2-point traits are pretty good, but since most of the action came from ranged attacks, and I don't have any steroids in terms of accuracy, I really like that one. Cultural traits. The Ritual Cannibals is outright amazing in this build, since mana is extremely important for your whole strategy later down the road, and corpse eating is an amazing skill for the Reaver faction in general, since they are quite squishy. As a free action, healing yourself is really good. Also, it denies people that make use out of bodies. The other trait I picked up was Powerful Evokers, but here I think is a swappable slot. I personally love picking it because it gives me a support unit right from the get-go, and it's pretty amazing in this start because it allows you to use the subdue shenanigans right from turn 1. But apart from that, the extra combat casting points in that trait are really useful because we will end up with a lot of battle mages and supporters, and that makes our options just more plentiful. Okay, let's talk tomes. So, tome-wise, we start out here with Cryomancy. Cryomancy offers you all the crowd control things that you would desire in this build. First and foremostly, freezing enemies does allow you to subdue them as well, which makes Ice Coffin very attractive. It's a starter spell for you. And the White Witches should be one of the first things you'd be aiming for, because they got a low cooldown 90% freeze, which allows you to just immobilize targets and or subdue them. So it's really cool because you can pick who's going to move, and you can use that movement denying also to make advantages, especially early on. These White Witches are amazing, but they stay useful and relevant. Frost Arrows and Frost Blades are really cool because we hire lots of different units from all different factions. These two spells will stay relevant all over the game since you will have plenty of receivers for that. Lesser Snow Spirit gives you a Skirmisher which has a low chance to freeze, but these guys, should they survive, transform into something with a high chance to freeze. So it's pretty good, and Blizzard never hurts because it's a map nuker. What I personally love is the Cryomancy School because it gives you a free research post, and with this build you can even play Arctic Adaptation if you'd wanted to. The second tome here, I'm picking Zeal, but here we have also worthy alternatives with the Enchantment Materium Tome and the Tome of the Horde. I stuck with Zeal out of various reasons. First of all, Condemnation. Condemnation does lower the enemy status resistance even more, and that's just really good, especially since it is lasting until the end of the battle. This spell allows you to soften up tier 3+ units for your subdue shenanigans. Legion of Zeal is a slight damage bonus, which is pretty cool because it doubles against condemned units. So here we have another nice synergy, and Inspiring Chant is a really cool thing. If you have zealous units, it's even turning into a steroid. Otherwise, it's a pretty good counter against moral shenanigans. The Zealots are a spam type unit, which can inflict condemnation. I love picking these guys, just slapping them in front of the enemy, whack, you inflict condemnation, you apply the stench, and you have a -5 status resistance afflicted to your enemy in no time. That's really, really good. Also, the condemnation can be, and actually should be, learned by your heroes as well. It's a novice battle mage skill, and it's really, really tasty. Tier 2, I really recommend to pick up Fertility next, because that's where your strategy goes bonkers, because we get access to nymphs. Nymphs can seduce the enemy. This is even more powerful than subduing the enemy, because it turns the units against the enemy, so you can utilize the enemy's strength against themselves, basically transform their units into throwaway stuff for you, which is really good. And as a little bonus on top of that, if they should survive, as of the Golem update, you even get to pay mana to keep the units. So once you have this book, you can hire units with war spoils and mana. And that was the point where I really felt like I was cheating. Animate Flora is really good for those situations where you just need something to get nuked or something to fall into the enemy's back, because we have a lot of spellcasting points due to the powerful evokers. Temple of Fertility, I like that one because it fits really well into the Reavers. The Reavers struggle a little bit with food production, and draft is always welcome with these guys. Blossom of Life, well, it's a big fat regeneration hex radius spell. I find it a tad bit costly, but if you have the mana, it's really useful. And Restore the Land, well, I rarely use that. Bountiful Fields go into a similar venue as the Temple of Fertility. Extra food and draft helps your cities to grow, and Revitalize is a spell that you have on the nymphs as well, so your heroes can turn into really powerful supporters. Once you hit tier 3, you have a lot of options. One of the things that I strongly recommend to pick up here, we are tier 2 still. The tier 3 comes after that. Tome of the Inquisition is the other tier 2 tome to pick up. It opens up more condemnation methods. Mass Condemnation allows you to put that onto a 1 hex radius. It also inflicts some damage, but 1 hex radius status reduction is really good for this build. It gives you access to the Inquisitors, which are super powerful skirmishers inflicting condemnation, but most importantly, they again have a ranged stun. A much more powerful ranged stun than your White Witches, so they are really good at tacking down enemies, nuking them, bursting them, or making them vulnerable for your subdue efforts. Tribunal is really cool because with the Cannibals trait and all the food from the Fertility book, I ended up with unstable cities quite often, and the Tribunal actually counters that by adding instability and rewards you at the same time for extra population. It's such a good fit for that build. I found it really amazing how good this was for this build. I didn't see that coming until I tried it out, and you should too. Burden of Guilt is, well, something interesting if you see the enemy coming. I rarely use it, but it is powerful, since it slows down the enemy tremendously. And Inquisitor's Mark is a pretty neat thing, since we rock skirmishes and we can abduct ranged units as well as use our own ranged units as well. That's really good. Although I gotta say, our culture does benefit from this not so much as other people, because we don't rock multi-attacks, but since you can abduct pretty much everything you want, this is only a very, very low limitation. Also, the skirmishers apply all of these in melee as well. Very worth pointing out. So, Tithe Collector is one thing that I also love. It's a big power upgrade for a mine, and it allows you to put mines where you don't have some. It's really good, since we have some Materium affinity allowing us to put mana mines. Now it's time to talk about the tier 3s. So, Tome of Sanctuary is one of the tier 3s I strongly recommend. It comes a little bit surprising, but after you are on your abduction spree, Support is one of the things which are amazing to keep your strategy alive. Anointed People makes your backline really, really resilient against your own shenanigans, so it's pretty hard to convert you. Keeper's Mark makes all of your units much, much harder to kill, and since you can abduct a lot of these unit types successfully, you have a really, really good time with these. So your throwaway units become more resolveful, or, well, whatever, you know what I mean. Hard to kill. And Salvation is a costly, albeit very powerful spell, but only costly in terms of mana, not so terribly much for the battle combat spell points, as it is really powerful because it's the burst heal, one of the best ever. And Healing Spires and Consecrated Domain are pretty good for defense if you ever should need it. Sanctuary is amazing as it provides extra mana and another conduit. So this build has research facilities and conduits as special province improvements free, and I really, really like that. It's pretty, pretty good. And Sanctify is a bit costly, but it is a real powerhouse in terms of resilience if you ever need to protect somebody, but I still feel like it's not a good cost and return ratio. Now, when you go for the other tier 3 things that you want to go for, I strongly recommend Tome of the Dreadnought in this build as well. Simply because it synergizes darned well with all the immobilization shenanigans that you got. You have Pinning Barrage, opening up immobilization for a 2-hex radius, and mind you, everything immobilized can be subdued. And this is a really huge opener for you to pick out who you want to subdue in the enemy side. It marks, so it increases the damage for your Reavers, and 20 damage is nothing to sneeze at either. This spell alone is really brilliant, but it does become much better. Warding metals, so if you get lucky enough to capture some shields and constructs, makes them super resilient against magic attacks. Tuning kits is very, very specific. If you happen to abduct a lot of constructs, it is powerful, but only then, so handle with care. Destabilized Mana Core, though, it's the same logic. Since we are good at pinning down people, we are also good at letting them explode in this thing. Same venue goes for the artillerist, gives our heroes that are experts in the warfare skill another nice nuke. So you have a lot of goodness here, and the War Foundry is pretty synergistic with what we do because I end up having lots of mines in my Materium builds because you can make mana mines later down the road. I didn't use Ironclads too much. The Great Bombard, though, is really good if you want to siege cities because you are kind of a conquering type. After that, it is up to you if you want to go for the higher tier order tomes, because the Exaltation and Supremacy tomes are really good for you. So Supremacy gives you access to the Eagle Riders, which is a shield unit that also deals a lot of damage and does buff your dudes as well. Condemn Army is, well, lowering the status resistance for the entire army before the fight even starts. This is really, really nice. I like that. Supreme Magic is finally something that makes your supporters and your battle mages really hit harder because they, or well, it doesn't not necessarily make them hit that much harder, but the last hit explosion thing is really nice. And yeah, Anthem of Victory, if you can't pay it, it's just an amazing little steroid. And Supreme Magic allows you to do the same thing for your heroes, so you get a lot of AoE options all of a sudden with this tome, which came for me as sort of a surprise. And Monument of Supremacy is again good for the city stability thing. Exaltation is all about your survivability things and also offering you late game options that you require. Angel Eyes makes your own racial units really powerful, but mind you, it is only for your racials, not for the abducted people. Ascended Warriors, well, it's a good level up thing. The Shrine of Smiting is pretty cool, especially since we have then only faithful units with the Orin race, and these guys hit quite hard. the more faithful stuff is around. Mind you that we already start out with the spirit damage here. At the end of this road, you have a lot of spirit damage going on there. Temple of Exalted is also a really, really cool thing, going into the points where we are already strong at city stability and mana production. And after that, you can either backtrack into old tomes. Like I said, Tome of the Horde is really, really good for this build, as is Tome of Enchantment, due to Seeker Arrows and Sundering Blades. Sundering Blades is also inflicting status resistance. Spell-Tempered Shields, if you have shields, is pretty good. And another worthy candidate to mention is the Tome of Alchemy, because you can utilize Miasma pretty well, and the Afflictors are really, really useful. And all in all, you have a lot of benefit out of that one too. It's up to you how you want to build from there on. Even the tier 3 Transmutation Tome is a really, really good fit, since Dreadnought pumps you up to 3 Materium Affinity. You get here AoE stunners and power-ups for defensiveness in your own army, as well as another status resistance lowering nuke in form of melt armor. This build is very versatile in this regard. Good, that's been the tomes. Let's talk about the roster. So your roster is very much focused around your overseers. You want to have a lot of supporters in this build. I run on an 18 unit stack, typically 4 to 6 supporters, a mix of overseers and nymphs. These are really, really good. Bring some mage locks, because they are your units that are really good in clearing out tier 1 and tier 2 units quickly, because often you want to just blast them away, and even without too many buffs, these guys are hidden quite hard, and they can apply marking to the enemies, which results in a 10% damage buff due to focused aggression. And of course, all of your abductees can get this skill too, in form of the focus engraving, which is amazing in that regard, because this makes your mage locks really versatile. They clear out weak enemies and they soften up hot enemies for the takedown. I really like that combination. The Harriers are your early game immobilizers, and they stay relevant if you cannot afford any White Witches, or if you need something with a more melee-based or physical-based damage type. The mercenaries will wear out quite quickly. They are pretty good early on due to the drive back and a decent amount of damage as the spear carriers they are, but they are units you will be not using too much after a while, because you are more interested in crowd control skills and they don't provide any. Therefore, White Witches are way to go as soon as you have researched them. I tried it out. You basically cannot have too many of them, because they just synergize with your build so darn well. Mind you that the subdue of the Overseers has no run out time. As soon as something is subdued, it stays like that until the end of the combat, unless the Overseer dies. That means if you have 3 Overseers subduing 3 targets, you have 3 enemies out of combat. And that's why this build is actually stupidly strong, because you can't just decide who's not going to participate in the fight anymore. And with all the status resistance reductions you got, you're pretty good at converting high-tier units as well. But moving on forward, the Dragoons are here not really needed for that build. You can pretty much skip the entire tier 3 if you'd wanted to, because you won't be recruiting too much Magelock cannons, because your war sports are better used elsewhere. You want to recruit units with that your overseers are converting. So these guys, feel free to bring them in. They are good, by all means, but my experience has shown me that I didn't have too many war sports left, and the Inquisitors are just amazing. A worthy or a recommendation goes towards all spider critters that you can pick up, because spiders are really, really good, since they all have immobilizing traits, as have earth elementals of higher levels. They also have immobilizing. Basically, whatever can immobilize is good for your build, which brings me right next to the strategizing part. Strategy-wise, your goal is to build up a largest possible army and keep it growing and growing and keep killing stuff as fast as possible. Wars with people right next door to you are really good. You shouldn't actually conquer the city right from the get-go. It's much better to raid their troop stacks for the war spoils to keep converting things. Don't shy away from stressing out your income very hard early on. I really had good experiences with just amassing as many units as I quickly was able to, and in combat it's obvious you should always try to keep your supporters alive, and you don't need to flinch the tiniest little bit if something tier 1 or tier 2 dies in the front line. As you see here, this setup is really wild. It's mostly supporters and it's a couple of heroes, but it works surprisingly well due to the fact that I can convert whatever runs into my face, and I'm running a couple of defensive units. This is very important. You should totally try to abduct yourself a couple of shield units, something that can hold the line for you, because you have a ton of supporters, you have a ton of healing, but you need people that can reliably survive the initial burst. That's where also the signature skills can come into play with all the summonings, which are also really, really good. You can also mitigate the initial burst on the enemy units via the nymphs later down the road. Besides that, it's really important to point out your weakest point are your first two tomes. You are really not strong during that part. When you only have Zeal and Cryomancy going, you are, at least for brutal AIs, really difficult, easy to tackle. So you should try to stay peaceful until you have the fertility tome going and a couple of those nymphs recruited. After that, it's really hard to stop you. What I really want to point out here as the last thing, the neutral stacks here on the map become your recruitment centers. Especially on brutal difficulty, it's quite easy to recruit friendly fellows like these, and you should always try to consider what you have more. If you have been successfully farming war spoils, requires some training and some practice. Basically, you want to be at war with a neutral city or a AI at all times. So you either subdue them with your overseers for recruitment of war spoils, or you go in with the nymphs to convert them with mana. Just keep in mind, when you seduce them with the nymphs, you are working on a clock. The moment they are seduced, you have only 3 turns time to get the thing going, unless you need to redominate them. Tier 4 units like these are pretty hard to convert. You have usually only a 50% chance, even under optimal circumstances, but on the other hand, it's a 50% chance of getting a tier 4 unit basically for free. So yeah, I'll leave the rest up to you to find it out. It's a little bit different from everything that I've played before, but it is such a fun build. And the last thing before I forget mentioning it, you can also play this one if you'd like to with the Beacon Tome, which offers you Lightbringers, which have Convert, which is a very similar skill like Seduce. I just went for Seduce instead because the Tome of the Beacon spells weren't as synergistic with this build as the fertility spells were, and the Convert spell has also 1 turn more cooldown than the Seduction spell, so I figured that one I liked more. Okay, so feel free to leave me your comments down below. I'm eager to hear back from you. This abduction scheme is one of the most fun ways I've discovered so far to play the Reavers, and since it worked in brutal environment, it is surely a worthy thing to try out. Just give it a little bit of experimentation. I had to adapt my strategy before I noticed that it's all about swarming and taking the opposition as quick as possible and having huge army stacks. Leave me a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and of course down there in the description box are plenty of cool links to other Age of Wonders things, and also Patreon, PayPal, and Buy Me a Coffee. I'd be delighted if you'd give them a look, and thanks to all the supporters of this channel at this point. And especially a big thanks to you watching this video up until after the ad roll. I deeply appreciate, and have a good time until we meet again.